Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
When justice is defined as violent retributive punishment, it creates a tomb for hope and the human imagination. But when justice is defined as restorative, it waters the seeds that sit silent in the soil. In episode 14, I shared the audio of men like R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, Steve Lawson, and Tim Keller promoting the idea of justice being a wrath-expressing violence of retributive punishment. But today I want to shift toward a conversation about resurrection and restorative justice. And I want to begin with Pope Francis, who passed away this morning. The Vatican released a statement saying, at 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. Francis, who was the first pope from Latin America and from the Jesuit order, had been the pope since March 13th, 2023. Anthea Butler, who is Catholic and an MSNBC columnist, and who was my first guest on Highest Power, Church and State, wrote, Francis will be remembered for his charismatic pastoral reign and sometimes contentious and controversial papacy, and his reshaping of the College of Cardinals in a way that shifted the Church's axis of power outside of Europe. She noted how Francis forsook the traditional papal apartments and instead moved into the Casa Santa Marta. The complex feelings around Francis' time as Pope are illustrated in the responses to statements he made on a plane after visiting Brazil. When asked about LGBTQ people, Francis said, if someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? But then during the same interview, Francis affirmed prohibitions against women ever being priests. Regarding the Church's sex abuse scandals, Butler shares how Francis met with survivors and offered apologies, but at the same time, he was criticized for not bringing enough reform. Because he broadened the membership of the College of Cardinals beyond an overwhelmingly European and North American makeup, Butler says it is likely that the next pontiff will not be from Europe, but from another continent. Of course, Francis' valuing of people from other parts of the world than Europe and North America can lead to tensions with those who are hyperfixated on retributive policies, such as deportation or the death penalty. One person Pope Francis has clashed with this year has been Vice President J.D. Vance, who ironically met with the Pope yesterday, less than 24 hours before Francis died. Francis has criticized the Trump administration's policies on immigration, cuts in U.S. aid, and even Vance's interpretation of Catholic doctrine. So I sat down to discuss Pope Francis and restorative justice with Nicole Wiesen, who is the Director of Communications with Georgians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. She recently wrote a piece for Baptist News Global titled Abolishing the Death Penalty in the Spirit of Easter and Passover. So I wanted to get her thoughts on resurrection as the liberation of restorative justice. I'd like to start off by asking you about Pope Francis. Especially because while anyone who has that amount of power in a religious institution, such as the Catholic Church, is going to be controversial at times, it seemed that Francis had a desire for moving the church away from retributive justice toward a more restorative posture in the world. And even though hierarchies tend to fuel retribution on those who won't submit, Francis seemed to develop a reputation for fostering a more restorative posture. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how those with religious institutional power might lay aside their power as something to be grasped and break the cycles of retribution that are so often a feature of hierarchy.
Thank you. That's such a rich and important question, Rick. I really appreciate you framing it so thoughtfully. Pope Francis has certainly been one of the most compelling figures in recent Catholic history when it comes to challenging entrenched systems of power and punishment. His consistent emphasis on mercy over judgment and his call for abolition of the death penalty and his outreach to marginalized, including prisoners, have all signaled a desire to shift the church's moral compass away from retributive models of justice towards something far more restorative and deeply human. That said, your point about hierarchy is critical. The paradox of religious institutions is that they often preach humility, grace, and service while being structured around intense concentrations of power. For me, Francis, perhaps more than any other of his predecessors, has seemed to wrestle with that paradox, choosing simplicity, living in a guest house rather than the papal apartments, and speaking openly about the sickness of clericalism. But the challenge, as you know, and is noted, that even well-intentioned leaders operate with systems that are fundamentally hierarchical, and that those systems often protect themselves through control, exclusion, and even retribution. So, how might someone with institutional religious power lay it down, so to speak? I think it begins with a deep theological and existential reckoning, a reorientation from power over to power with. This involves creating proximity with the wounded, the silenced, the criminalized, not to serve them from a pedestal, but to learn from them and be transformed by their stories. It also demands a willingness to divest, not just symbolically, but structurally. That means opening the doors of decision making to those outside the inner sanctions of authority, especially those who have experienced harm at the hands of the church or other institutions. For me, ultimately, it's modeling a kind of leadership that doesn't cling to status, but instead risks vulnerability in the service and collective healing. That's the essence of restorative justice, not just a theory of crime and punishment, but as a way of being in the world. Curious to how you see that playing out in their space.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's absolutely critical is that that mindset of just laying aside your own privilege and also like giving a voice to those who have not been given a voice has been such a key piece to it. And listening to voices that you may not even have been aware even existed. Like that's been a big key for me too. It's been like a lot of times I feel like there's such a lack of awareness of what voices are out there to even hear from.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that one. One thing most marginalized communities struggle with is voice. Or you have people who want to speak for those marginalized communities, but never step foot in those communities.
Hmm.
So for me, it's, you know, you can't talk about us without us. So,
Yeah, that makes sense. I
mhm.
like how you in your piece that you wrote for BNG, you speak in terms of three spiritual truths. You talk about liberation from bondage, triumph over death, and the sacredness of life. And I loved how you often paired the words liberation and resurrection in your piece. So I'd love to hear your thoughts more on like the idea of resurrection as liberation from the tombs that the empires cause in our culture today.
Absolutely. Um, I love that you were picking up on the pairing of liberation and resurrection, because to me, resurrection isn't just about a singular miraculous event in history. It's an ongoing disruptive force that refuses to let death have the final word, especially the kinds of death dealing systems empires thrive on. When I think of resurrection as liberation, I think of all of the tombs we're forced into by the empire, which is like mass incarceration, poverty, racial violence, gender based oppression, and the relentless commodification of human life. These are not just metaphorical tombs, they are the real systemic structures that bury people alive. Empire builds them with the intention, labels them as justice, safety, or order, and then dares to call them good. So resurrection insists otherwise for me. It insists that even with empire rules of stone in place, even when it seals it with the laws of justifications of life with breakthrough, and not just in all spiritual realms, but in the material one as well. Through abolition, through healing justice, through the work of restoring what's been torn apart. Liberation then should be a movement of resurrection. It is the embodiment that the holy refusal to stay buried. It's the Mary Magdalene running from the tomb with good news. It is the formerly incarcerated woman finding her voice and power. It is the community building something new where empire only imagined decay. So when you talk about resurrection as liberation, we're not only talking about a theological idea, we're also talking about a call to action, a call to roll away the stones ourselves, to become resurrection people who expose and dismantle the tombs of empire wherever we might find them.
Yeah, I love that because, like, especially in a lot of white Christian spaces, I feel like resurrection is a concept that you're told you have to affirm, and it almost becomes like another form of empire. Do you affirm the resurrection? And it's like you totally miss this. What's going on here is this being liberated from the tomb that the Roman Empire caused. Like,
Yeah.
I love how you're speaking to that embodied liberation that comes from it, as opposed to just turning it strictly into a tool of empire.
Right.
In your article, you say Christians believe Jesus was executed by the state, an innocent man condemned to die. If we truly embrace resurrection, we must reject systems that mirror Rome's cruelty and injustice. But unfortunately, like when we look at especially white Christianity, we see the history of the church, we tend to see examples of the church sacralizing Rome's cruelty and injustice. I'm curious, like, why do you think it's so difficult for Christians to reject systems that mirror Rome's cruelty and injustice?
I think that question cuts to the heart of so much of our struggle today. And it's one that often some of my friends wrestle with as well. I think one of the deepest reasons Christians, particularly within the white Christianity, have struggled to reject systems that mirror Rome's cruelty and injustice is because empire offers comfort in exchange for complicity. Over time, the church has moved from being a persecuted community of margins to a powerful institution at the center. And with that shift came the tragic theological reversal. Rather than challenging the empire like Jesus did, the church began to bless it, to the to theologize its violence and to dress its punishments in sacred language. There is also the fact that empire trains us to believe that order, punishment, and dominance are synonymous with peace. Rome called for the Pax Romana, peace through brutal control, and so many Christians inherited that same logic, imagining to maintain peace or righteousness meant building prisons, enforcing rigid hierarchies, or endorsing state violence in the name of law and order. It's a peace that crucifies. And it's hard to reject that because it's so deeply embedded, not just in our theology, but in our liturgies, our architecture, our history books, and it feels normal. And what resurrection demands of us is to see clearly that normal is not neutral, that what we call justice might be looked at as vengeance, that we've been labeled holiness may actually be collusion with the empire. So it's difficult to reject because it would mean that a kind of unlearning, a dying of what has felt secure. But that's the invitation to the cross and to the empty tomb, isn't it? Not to protect ourselves within the walls of the empire, but to follow Jesus outside the gates where the condemned are. I mean, if we're truly going to embrace resurrection, we have to stop worshiping the crosses we were called to dismantle. We have to be there with the people outside the gates and begin to work within our communities to make that turn by sacralizing the empire and embodying the resurrection.
Yeah, that makes
Don't you
sense.
think?
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned, like, speaking of the condemned who are outside the gates, you talk about how black defendants are more likely to receive the death sentence than if the victim is white. And And then you say this is not justice, it is a modern day lynching wrapped in legal language.
Mhm.
So, do you see these injustices? Do you think they have more to do with a conscious embrace of racism, or are they more the result of ignorantly being unaware of our subconscious biases in white communities?
That's a powerful and necessary question. And the answer, I think, is both yes and. There's no doubt that some of the injustices stem from the conscious embrace of racism. We just can't get away from it. We have to be honest about the fact that our legal and penal systems were built with racial hierarchies in mind. The death penalty itself in the US has roots that trace directly back to slavery, lynching, and Jim Crow. It's not a coincidence that the Black lives have been historically devalued in both life and in death. When a system consistently produces racially desperate outcomes, we have to recognize that it's not broken, it's just functioning as it was designed. With that being said, a huge part of the ongoing harm is perpetuated through unconscious bias, through people who may not see themselves as racist, but who have been deeply conditioned by the narrative that associate Blackness with criminality and whiteness with innocence. Judges, juries, prosecutors, they're all shaped by these cultural messages. And if they don't consciously believe them, and when these subconscious biases go unexamined or unchallenged, they do real devastating harm. So, in a sense, the system's violence is both intentional and internalized. It is a legacy of conscious white supremacy carried forward by structures that make it easy for people to look away and deny responsibility. Calling it the modern day lynching wrapped in legal language is about naming that is and isn't just for the fortunate side to effect of the flawed system. It is a form of state violence with a clear through line to our country's racial history. And until we're confronted both with the overt racism of the quieter, more insidious bias of the system, we'll keep doing exactly what it was built to do. I wonder what your experience is in naming these truths in these spaces that are often resistant to them. I mean, do you ever think that
Yeah.
we'll be able to move that unlearned behavior?
It's tough because like I know for me personally, um like I was a very conservative evangelical. I didn't vote for Trump in 2016, but I was to the point where I was like I couldn't vote for him, but I was happy that he won.
Mm.
And I know how much I've changed over the last 8 years or so. And it's and yet when I see a lot of others that I'm around, like it seems almost impossible, that a lot of people are going to change.
Mhm.
And so it's just a big part of it for me was having the humility to begin listening to people that I differed from, and not to feel threatened by them, but to connect with them on a human level. And then like when I could actually like see their wounds and see the things that was causing them pain, like I could see a common um human struggle with them, and like I could see my neighbor and myself, and that's kind of what opened me up to listening beyond what I was.
Awesome.
You mentioned that cycle though, like of how like retribution leads to retribution. And in your piece, you say executing someone does not restore what was lost. It only deepens the cycle of violence. And like on a philosophical level, I completely agree with that. But then on a personal level, like when you meet with people who are victims of crimes and you can understand their desire to see whoever hurt their family member um, punished, especially in violent crimes. And so I'm curious how you would approach a conversation with someone who um, is processing a lot of those feelings of grief and anger that are legitimate, Is, do you approach them with ideas about restorative justice, or is or what's needed in that moment something different, more just sitting silently with them in their grief?
Yeah, it's challenging, and that's a compassionate and honest question, and I deeply appreciate the tension um, you're holding between a philosophical conviction and the human empathy. It's where real transformative justice begins, not with theory, but with presence. When someone has lost a loved one to violence, especially murder, I believe the first response should never be an argument. It should be witness. The most sacred thing we can offer is to sit in the ashes with them, hold space for their grief, their rage, their confusion. Those emotions are not wrong or shameful, they're human. And I think that's the one thing we all forget is the human form of it. And justice, if we're going to be real, has to honor that pain and not bypass it. So in those moments, the conversation isn't about retribution versus restoration. It's about survival, and it's about giving people the dignity of being heard, the freedom to feel everything without judgment, and the reassurance that their pain matters and that it's real. Over time, if we and when they're ready, they may not be open, or they may be open to openly and gently explore that deeper question. What does healing look like for you? What would accountability mean if it didn't come through execution? What do you need to live with this loss, not just legally, but emotionally and potentially spiritually? Some survivors, do reach a place where they can see the death penalty not as justice, but as another act of violence that keeps them tethered to the harm, and others don't. And that's really okay too. The goal isn't to change the minds, it's to walk with them, to honor their humanity, and to ensure that our systems don't exploit their grief just to justify more killing. Ultimately, love sits first. Justice can wait its turn. Have you been able to ever hold space for someone? I mean, that's one of the things
Yeah.
we need to ask.
I think, yeah, I think what stands out to me with this is like to hold space with someone who's in that experience, you have to be around them and be present with them, like as friends to begin with. And I think a lot of times these questions come up. They're not questions that people are actually wrestling with in community with people who are suffering. They're more like hypothetical questions, like that are proposed by people in power who just want to punish others. They're like, well, what about the victims? And it's like, well, this isn't really, you're not coming
Right.
with this question with a posture of empathy. You're coming at this question with a desire to punish someone.
Right. And why relive that pain over and over again?
Yeah. So
Mhm.
So you close your piece by saying faith does not demand retribution, it demands restoration. It calls us to recognize the image of God even in those who have caused harm and to believe in the possibility of transformation. And like we were kind of touching on it a little bit earlier, like one of the things I struggle with is having hope that certain people could ever change. Like the idea of President Trump just having this change of heart, it just sounds impossible. Or
Right.
just or like on a more personal level, certain relatives that we have or friends that we have, like it seems impossible. And so I'm curious, like, how do you have hope for people to change when it seems impossible? And then also, like, how can we deal with our own hesitancy to demand restoration? Because some of these people, like, I don't even want to be restored with them, if I'm quite honest.
Right. And, that's a raw, honest reflection. And honestly, I think it's in the heart of what makes this work so deeply human and so deeply hard. You're not alone in that struggle, and hope is not always natural. It often feels like discipline, something we choose in spite of what we see or feel. So, for me, hope isn't about a naive optimism or pretending people haven't caused real harm. It's not even about denial of accountability. It's the refusal to believe that harm is the end of the story. I've seen people who have committed some of the most unthinkable acts come to a place of deep remorse and transformation, and not because that the system reinforced them, but because someone offered them the dignity of being seen as more than just their worst moment. But that kind of hope has to be rooted in truth. It doesn't ignore the pain. It certainly doesn't rush reconciliation. It doesn't pressure survivors to be saints, but it holds the tension that both things can be true, that someone can cause real deep harm and still carry the image of God, that we can want justice and still feel the string of their own ambivalence, that we can believe in restoration even if we don't want it personally right now. And the last part is key. Restoration isn't the same as reconciliation. You don't have to be in a relationship with someone to believe that that they have a capacity to change. Restoration is about the possibility of repair, not the obligation to re-enter a relationship, not the expectation to forget or forgive before you're ready. Sometimes the most restorative thing we can do is say, I hope you find your way to healing, but I'm not required to go with you.
Yeah.
So when I wrestle with whether someone can change or if I can even want them to, I remind myself that hope doesn't mean I trust them right now. It means I believe that their story isn't finished, and I can hold space for that truth, even if I'm not ready to write the next chapter with them. I just hope that we can all stay grounded in that feeling of tension between ache for justice and the fatigue for holding hope.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me.
I love what she said about hope believing that the story is unfinished. To me, that feels very honoring of the grief and hurt people feel on the underside of power, and honest about the harm people cause who are agents of empire in the world. The problem with retributive justice, especially when it comes to the death penalty, is that it finishes the story by placing it in a tomb and burying it. And as a result, it doesn't heal. But restorative justice allows us to be present with the harm and the hurt, to face all the implications of empire, and to allow our imagination to be stirred as the seeds of resurrection are watered. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.